Ever since Elon Musk and Tesla announced that they were getting rid of even radar and going with a vision-only driving system, people have been complaining about situations like fog and rain and snow and low light and saying that there's no way that a vision system can work under those circumstances. But in the recent Lex Fridman interview, Elon Musk really got into the weeds about this and talked about exactly how the car can not only drive as well as a human under those circumstances, but can drive in a superhuman manner better than James Bond. Let's take a look. For those of you interested in investing, check out Webull, an amazing platform for buying and selling stocks, and now cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Dogecoin, and others. Open an account and get a free stock valued at up to $200, and fund your account and get another free stock valued at up to $2,300. Check out the link in the description and help the channel at the same time. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. Before I get into the meat of this video topic today, which I think is amazing, I've been wanting to do this for a while. There's been talk about photon counts and things like that for about a month. And so with the celebration of the new year, Happy New Year to everybody, I wanted to do this video. But first, I want to talk about big goings on in both Giga Berlin and in Giga Texas. Both places appear to be actually producing cars, and both places appear to actually be producing cars that they are sending out to be tested for crash tests and other things like that. So first, there's a couple of recent photographs from the 30th and 31st of December that show some black Model Y, probably performance models, that are out on the road or on trucks or things like that. Probably they're being used for crash tests or something along those lines as a pre-production thing to ensure that they are safe, by EU standards before they are sold. But also, just breaking right before I recorded this video, which was on the 31st of December, Joe Tagmeyer actually said that there is evidence that there are Model Ys that are actually being driven around inside the Tesla Gigafactory. And if you've seen this thing, it's absolutely huge. So no surprise that they could be driving it around internally. But they've not only been driving them around internally inside the factory, but they've actually produced some models and sent them out interstate-wise to be tested by, I assume, NHTSA, to make sure, of course, that they're as safe as the other Model Ys. So I think it's a real neck and neck race. It'll be really interesting to see which of the two Gigafactories will ship the first car to a customer. I assume one of them will do so in January of 2022. Hopefully both of them will, and hopefully both of them will ramp rather quickly. So anyway, it'll be a nice little competition to see who actually wins and who delivers a car first. All right, so on to the topic du jour, which is about photon counts and latency and jitter and control systems and all sorts of things like that that are super nerdy, but really, really important to the way that your Tesla is going to be driving in the future. Not as important for right this second, because these things are all being worked on currently, but probably with version 11 of the full self-driving beta software, which might very well be the next one that comes out. This is all going to start to roll out. So it's going to be really, really interesting to see how this works. So again, the original inspiration for this episode came from some tweets that were online in the last several weeks. But as it turns out, it was a little bit fortunate that I was busy, because Lex Fridman and Elon Musk, from about the 1 hour, 21 minute and 20 second-ish mark up to about 1 hour, 26.5 minutes or so around 5 minutes there, they spent quite a while talking about photons, about latency, about jitter, and about control systems. So what I'm going to do here is cut up a few little pieces of this 5-minute thing. I highly recommend, of course, watching the original and, of course, the original 2.5 hour interview. Link is in the description, of course. And thank you to Lex Fridman for asking some really, really interesting and insightful questions, and for Elon, of course, for answering them in a very honest and thorough manner.
I think one of the things we're moving towards now is no post-processing of the image through the image signal processor. So like for what happens for cameras is that, well, almost all cameras, is they there's a lot of post-processing done in order to make pictures look pretty. And so we don't care about pictures looking pretty. We just want the data. So we're moving to just raw photon counts. So the system will, like, the image that the computer sees is actually much more than what you'd see if you represented it on a camera. It's got much more data. And even in very low light conditions, you can see that there's a small photon count difference between, this spot here and that spot there, which means that, so it can see in the dark incredibly well, because it can detect these tiny differences in photon counts, like much better than you could possibly imagine. And then we also save 13 milliseconds on latency.
From removing the post-processing on the image?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like, because we've got 8 cameras, and then there's roughly, I don't know, 1.5 milliseconds or so, maybe 1.6 milliseconds of latency for each camera, and so it basically bypassing the image processor gets us back 13 milliseconds of latency, which is important. And we track latency all the way from photon hits the camera to all the steps that it's got to go through to get go through the various neural nets and the C code, and there's a little bit of C++ there as well. Well, maybe a lot, but the core stuff is the heavy duty computers all in C, and so we track that latency all the way to an output command to the drive unit to accelerate, the brakes to slow down, the steering turn left or right. So because you got to output a command, that's got to go to a controller, and like some of these controllers have an update frequency that's maybe 10 hertz or something like that, which is slow. That's like now you lose 100 milliseconds potentially. So then we want to update the drivers on the, like say, steering and braking control to have more like 100 hertz instead of 10 hertz, and you get a 10 millisecond latency instead of 100 milliseconds worst case latency. And actually, jitter is more of a challenge than latency, because latency is like you can anticipate and predict, but if you've got a stack up of things going from the camera to the computer through then a series of other computers and finally to an actuator on the car, if you have a stack up of tolerances, of timing tolerances, then you can have quite a variable latency, which is called jitter, and that makes it hard to anticipate exactly how you should turn the car or accelerate, because if you got maybe 150, 200 milliseconds of jitter, then you could be off by up to 0.2 seconds, and this could make a big difference.
Yeah, you have to. So the jitter is in the sensor information, or the jitter can occur at any stage in the pipeline.
You can, if you have fixed latency, you can anticipate and like say, okay, we know that our information is, for argument's sake, 150 milliseconds stale. Okay. Like so, for 150, for argument's sake, 150 milliseconds from photons taken camera to where you can measure a change in the acceleration of the vehicle. So then you can say, okay, well, we're gonna we know it's 150 milliseconds, so we're gonna take that into account and compensate for that latency. However, if you've got then 150 milliseconds of latency plus 100 milliseconds of jitter, which could be anywhere from 0 to 100 milliseconds on top. So then your latency could be from 150 to 250 milliseconds. Now you've got 100 milliseconds that you don't know what to do with. And that's basically random. So getting rid of jitter is extremely important.
And that affects your control decisions and all those kinds of things. Okay.
Yeah, the car is just going to fundamentally maneuver better with lower jitter.
Got it.
And the cars will maneuver with superhuman ability and reaction time much faster than a human. I mean, I think over time, the autopilot, full self-driving will be capable of maneuvers that are far more than what like James Bond could do in like the best movie type of thing.
That's exactly what I was imagining in my mind as you said it.
It's like impossible maneuvers that a human couldn't do.
All right, so there's a lot in that video clip there. So let's kind of break things down. The first thing I want to do is I want to talk about cameras. So let's just talk about like this camera right here. Actually, there's 3 of them, but just imagine there's one. So a digital camera is not what you think it is. In fact, your eyes are not what you think they are. What's going on is that you have got photons, right? So you've got the lights that are shining in this room, and they are coming and they are impinging upon the glass in this lens, and then they get focused through the glass and whatever, and they end up at a CMOS sensor. Interestingly enough, Elon Musk said that it impinged on a CCD sensor. You can check that out in the video that I did a couple of days ago here. But he said CCD, but I went back and checked, and according to the best knowledge that we have, the cameras that Tesla uses are CMOS sensors, not CCD sensors. CCDs they actually have more sensitivity, but they're much more expensive and they're not as kind of high tech, I guess, as CMOS sensors. So anyway, maybe he knows something that we don't, and maybe they actually are using CCD sensors, but as far as I can tell, it looks like they're using CMOS sensors. That's the best evidence that we have right now. Anyway, it's not critically important to what we're talking about here, but the important part is that what happens is the photon gets focused by the glass and it hits a tiny little sensor and it knocks an electron. Each photon potentially knocks an electron off of this sensor. That then causes a cascade, which causes the electronics of the camera to sense this. And so you think to yourself, okay, well, that's exactly what's going on, and that's what I see when I look at the picture on my phone. I take the picture, I look at the picture, and that's what I've got. That nothing could be further from the truth. There is a whole bunch of image signal processing, or ISP, or sometimes DSP for digital signal processing, whatever. There is a bunch of stuff that happens between when the photon hits the sensor and when you see that picture. And all of those things are to make the image look more pleasant to you as a human being. So one of the things is noise reduction. There's a lot of noise reduction that goes on, which is all the little, like fuzzy stuff in a picture, right? You get rid of that. You change the gamma curve so that it looks good to the human eye. You enhance some details and reduce some other details. So there's a ton of processing that goes on in these images to make it look pretty to the human eye. The consequence of that is, for what a neural network wants, that's actually degrading that image. It looks really good to us human beings, but it's not nearly as useful to a Tesla autopilot piece of software, because what you really want is you want that original information. You want that raw information. You essentially want to count photons. That's effectively what these things do before all of the signal processing happens. You're counting photons, and you're counting the intensity, and of course you're passing them through color filters mechanically, so that you're counting the color of it as well as the intensity. But you want to, in order to drive the best possible, what you want to do is strip away all the stuff that makes it look pretty, and by the way, takes time. Elon said something rather interesting. He said that all of that signal processing takes about 13 milliseconds. So you've got 8 cameras, and each one of them is somewhere around 1.5 milliseconds of processing time, and all of that adds up to like 13 milliseconds of time. And you may think like, oh, no big deal, that's 13/1000ths of a second. But remember, this car is trying to drive at potentially 120, 140 kilometers per hour, or 70 or 80 miles per hour. It's trying to drive very, very quickly, and it has to make decisions really fast. And 13/1000ths of a second at that speed is actually critical. And you got to remember, you've got to add on a whole bunch of other stuff. In the clip, Elon talked about how, for argument's sake, he said, call the latency 150 milliseconds. He's probably actually being relatively accurate. So that's 0.15 seconds. That's 1.5 tenths of a second that you are delaying before anything happens. So you've got when the photons hit the camera to the part where a control can be made. In other words, it can steer, or it can brake, or it can accelerate. It needs to do one of those 3 things. So again, the control systems, it's kind of a known problem, although one of the interesting things that Elon talked about in this was that, generally speaking, the control systems have been at about 10 hertz, which means that there's 100 milliseconds. So it will make a decision like, turn the steering wheel a little bit. Then it will wait 1/10 of a second before it makes the next decision, turn the steering wheel a little bit more, or press the brakes, or something like that. So he's talking about reducing that to like 10 milliseconds between control decisions as opposed to 100. So that's a big deal in its own right, because if the timing of your control decision comes through just 1 millisecond after that 100 millisecond delay, so it makes a control decision, and then something arrives and says, oh gosh, you need to make a really fast change of time, right? There's 1/10 of a second delay with this 10 hertz system before it actually does something about that. So that's a really big deal. So if they can reduce that from 1/10 of a second to 1/100th of a second, you can have control decisions that are made much more quickly. Then the car ultimately to the user is going to feel smoother, but it's also going to be safer, because it's going to be able to make decisions faster and be able to make control decisions faster. So this latency issue is really, really a big deal. But the other thing that's absolutely huge, and that I think people really do not understand, and they need to understand, is that by counting raw photons, and this is something, again, I talked about in an episode up here, it was a Stanford research paper, that by counting raw photons as opposed to these processed images, you can actually basically see in the dark. You can see in the dark, you can see through fog, you can see through heavy rain, etc. etc., etc. So the car can see way better than a human being can because, of course, we're doing a whole bunch of signal processing with our brains. Our eyes take in really crappy stuff, and again, Elon in this interview, he talked about that. I don't have time to do that part of the clip, but go watch, go watch the full interview. He'll talk about that. Our eyes are not that great. We don't have that good a resolution in our eyes. We have holes in our eyes. We see like the veins and arteries in our eyes. We there's a bunch of junk that's there that our brains have to just get rid of in order for that to happen. So we have a lot of signal processing that goes on too. But basically, we don't see particularly well. These cameras at a raw level see better than humans. And so that allows you just a few photons coming from a dark scene can indicate that there is a person there as long as there has been training on that. And speaking of training, that is a big problem with doing this switchover, right? If you got, let's say, 500 million miles of post-processed signals that you've trained your neural networks on, that's great. But the neural networks, they're going to retrain, right? You don't have to do it from scratch, but they're going to have to kind of go from scratch again when you go to these new types of images, right? So you're going from a, people-pleasing, good-looking image that we're used to seeing, and then you're going to the raw photon counts, and the whole network, all of these networks are going to have to be retrained again. And that means that you also have to then collect data that now is raw data as opposed to post-processed data. So all of these things take massive amounts of data. The advantage that Tesla, of course, has right now is that they've got a lot of cars. Elon said somewhere around 2 million cars on the road right now. So there's around 2 million Teslas. Most of them are collecting data for Tesla. They can, of course, just turn off the signal processing and get the raw data so they can get all that in so they can retrain on that. Of course, a huge problem with this is if you had to manually label all of that data, it could take years to go back and relabel all of the data that you already did with the post-processed images with pre-processed images now. But the good part is that, again, as I've talked about in the AI Day stuff, Tesla is working very hard on creating auto-labeling systems. And so assuming that they've got the auto-labeling system working really well, they can just go back through and have the computer do all the labeling over again with a supercomputer. So as opposed to taking years, they can take, potentially days or weeks or months or something like that to regenerate the labels on all of this data. And a lot of the old data that they have is probably not that useful anyway because they've come up with new systems of vector labeling. They're doing essentially like video games. They're doing 3D space labeling right now as opposed to image-based labeling. So all of that stuff makes a really big difference, and they're probably having to go back and rework their data sets anyway to create clean data. But as part of that process, they can now use pre-processed images. So you can take these ultra dark scenes or something. I always think of ultra dark. That's the scariest thing for me, right? I'm driving at night, there's no lights around or anything, and there's a deer or a human being on the side of the road. And it's like, I need to see that deer or human being as soon as possible. And this is exactly the kind of situation where by counting these raw photons, the car can probably see the human being or the deer much, much sooner than I can, like multiple seconds sooner than I can see that with my own human eyes, right? So that gives it a huge advantage. It has a couple of seconds while you're driving is massive, right? That's the difference between having an accident and being able to stop the car or move it out of the way and not have an accident. So that is absolutely massive that they're able to do that, and it's huge. It depends on being able to train on all new data, which I believe, again, from the sounds of what they're talking about, it sounds like version 11 of the beta software, not the version 11 that's out in general, but the V11 beta software is going to actually be trained on these raw photon counts. And that's, of course, from Elon Musk saying that they already had this in alpha and they were driving it around. So I think that's where we're going. We will see what happens. It will probably make a significant step change difference, and we'll probably be able to see that significant change. Now, of course, as with all this new technology, when they do that, I expect there will be a couple of steps backwards. So version 11 will probably work really, really well under certain circumstances and have some little foibles that come along with it because it's new software again. So every time they re-architect this stuff, they have to redo all of these things. But anyway, I expect that, again, the headroom, you're always looking at how far are you and how far can you go? And with each of these iterations, they're raising the headroom. So it may not be better right now. In fact, it may be slightly worse right now, but they're raising the possibility. Those nines that they're chasing, the perfection of driving that they're chasing, they're able to get closer and closer to that perfection. They're, asymptotically approaching that. So every time they can bump the headroom up, and counting raw photons is going to really bump the headroom up. It's going to create the kind of edge and corner cases. It's going to allow them to deal with these kinds of corner cases much, much easier than the old system did. So all of that is really, really cool. I personally, I haven't heard anything about this, but I assume that the simulation that they are working on, that thing that they talked about again on AI Day, and if you haven't seen that, you can watch that episode as well. But the simulator that they had was simulating what the cameras saw, and that was clearly post-processed camera images. So I'm sure that they've redone the simulator or are working on that currently to do pre-processed images, which are going to be much more grainy and nasty looking and really unappealing to the human eye, but much better for training so that they can create, again, these weird scenarios like a moose crossing the road, or a person walking in the middle of the road in the middle of the night wearing black clothes or something like that, right? Something incredibly difficult that hopefully you don't have a ton of real world examples of that because it's dangerous, but you can create simulations of that. And so if they can create that with the pre-processed look of the cameras, that is really huge as well. So the cars can see better than we can by using pre-processed images, and it reduces latency. The last thing that Elon Musk talks about is jitter. And what jitter is a variability, right? So he says if you know you've got 150 milliseconds or 0.15 seconds of delay between when you see something and when you can make a decision about that, you can project that into the future. You can be like, okay, I'm always going to be 0.15 seconds behind. But if there's a 0 to 200 millisecond jitter, that means that it could be anywhere from 150 milliseconds to 350 milliseconds. So it could be from 0.15 to 0.35 seconds of delay. And that's much harder to plan around because you don't know when you're making a control decision, you want to know that you're making it an exact amount of time away from the input, right? You always know it's 0.15 seconds stale information that you've got. But if it's 0.15 to 0.35 seconds stale, you may be making a decision that's out of date by a significant amount, almost a half a second. So Elon really didn't get into exactly how they're controlling jitter, but he said that they're working really, really hard to reduce the jitter of that processing. And just in case you don't understand what that means is there's the photons hit the sensors, then processing has to happen, even though it's not doing full signal processing. Then it has to go through all of the neural networks, and then it has to make a decision, and then that decision has to be passed on to the control system. Every single step in there not only has a latency, but has a variable latency. So one thing might take 10 milliseconds, but that might be 10 milliseconds plus or minus 5 milliseconds. So it could be 5 milliseconds to 15 milliseconds. And you start adding up each of those things and you get variable latency. And that is, obviously that is a problem. What that's going to lead to from a human standpoint is we will probably notice the car drives in a more jerky manner. It doesn't feel as good to us. And of course, from a safety standpoint, it could make a poor decision because it's not dealing with the information. It thinks that the information is 0.15 seconds stale, but it's actually 0.35 seconds stale, so it makes a mistake in terms of a decision. So in the end, all of this stuff is massively important, and it's really going to be interesting to see how it works. In my mind, the most important thing is the fact that they've gotten rid of image signal processing. They've gotten rid of the ISP stuff. They're going with raw photon counts. That's going to allow them access to the raw data, and the raw data is going to help. If we were looking at it as human beings, the images would look ugly as hell, but there's so much more information in there for the training network. And one little extra tidbit for those who do neural network training, raw image data has a ton of noise in it. And as I'm sure a lot of people who do this kind of work know, a lot of times what you do with these pictures, you get a picture of a cat or a dog or something, and you want to train on it. What you can do to kind of amplify your data set is you can inject noise into it, some Gaussian noise into the image. So from one image of a cat, you can produce 1,000 images of a cat with a little bit of noise added to it. And this raw data, without doing the signal processing, is going to give you that for free. You're going to get a much more robust training out of your neural networks because you've got a lot of noise in the original data. So that's just a little extra tidbit for those who actually care about that. For everybody else, the upshot of all of this is that, as Elon Musk said, the car is going to eventually be able to drive in a superhuman manner things that, even movie stars like James Bond, like movie characters like James Bond can't do in the movies even. Your Tesla eventually will become a superhero driver, and that is pretty darn cool. All right, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Yes, it's pretty geeky, but I hope you really enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun thinking about it and doing some research on it. Anyway, if you did enjoy the episode, please do like it so other people can find it, and also consider subscribing for more of this. Your subscription matters more than you can imagine. It's a really, really huge deal. So thank you to everyone who has subscribed. As always, a huge shout out to my patrons on Patreon. This is actually Discord. We've had a lot of discussions about this recently. So thank you all for helping me to crystallize this and for giving me ideas, etc. I really do appreciate the support, and I definitely appreciate the community that we are forming right now. So if you want to join the club, definitely check out the link in the description. And if you're interested in some awesome merch, check out the link in the description. We've got the Tesla Bot t-shirt, which is super popular these days. Don't mess with Tesla. Lots of other t-shirts, tumblers, mugs, etc. So check out the link in the description and help the channel out. And for those of you interested in investing, check out Webull, an amazing platform for buying and selling stocks, and now cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Dogecoin, and others. Open an account and get a free stock valued at up to $200, and fund your account and get another free stock valued at up to $2,300. Check out the link in the description and help the channel at the same time. Thank you. And finally, don't forget we are both Tesla and Amazon affiliates. If you look in the description, you can see how clicking on a link and going shopping for a solar roof, a power wall, or anything on Amazon helps out the channel. And as always, feel free to ask me questions in the comments or at my email address, which is drknowitallknows@gmail.com. Till next time, bye-bye.